Yeah, so my beaver origin story a few years ago, I guess in 2014 and 15, I was living in Seattle. These days, I live out in Spokane. But while I was in Seattle, I happened to attend this beaver restoration workshop. Essentially, I saw a flyer for a beaver workshop. I had no idea what that entailed exactly, but I knew that I liked beavers and was curious about whatever went on in a beaver workshop. So I went to this thing. And my mind was completely blown. There were some of the country's most eminent beaverologists at this conference. Kent Woodruff, former Forest Service biologist who ran the Methow Beaver Project in Winthrop, Michael Pollock and Chris Jordan from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Just some people who are really leading lights of the beaver world. And hearing their talks showed me that beavers aren't just these adorable little rodents. They're actually the primary movers and shakers of the natural world, responsible in large part for creating habitat for salmon and storing water and preventing erosion, providing all of these incredibly valuable services through their dam building and pond creation activities. So it was that conference followed up by a visit to the Methow Valley to see beaver restoration in action that turned me from just another beaver appreciator to a true fervent beaver believer. Anybody can be a beaver believer. It's not you don't have to pass a test or anything like that. You just have to accept deep in your heart that so many of our environmental problems, from biodiversity decline to drought to wildfire mitigation, can be, at least in some way, addressed through the restoration of these really amazing animals. Beavers are not, of course, they're not going to single-handedly save us from climate change and drought and wildfire and salmon collapse. But they do have a part to play, an important part to play in helping us tackle some of these problems. So a beaver believer is anybody who's looked at the evidence and been out of the landscape and has come to recognize that these are immensely important animals for all sorts of reasons. Beavers are generally monogamous, and they're really family-oriented animals. That's one thing that I think a lot of people admire about them, is they exist in these kind of cooperative colonies or family units where you've got the male and female, the generally monogamous pair, the newborn kits, the baby beavers, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds. So you've got 3 year classes of offspring all living together, all working on the dam and lodge together. The older siblings help to raise the younger siblings. They're cooperative breeders. They have these cool family structures, which means that if you're going to relocate beavers, take beavers from a place where, maybe they're clogging up a road culvert or flooding somebody's property or cutting down some valuable fruit trees. If you're going to take beavers from one of those nuisance sites and move them to some public land where they can do some good, moving one beaver by him or herself is probably not going to accomplish very much, right? Because again, they want to be in these families. So what the Methow Beaver Project does in the Methow Valley is they basically take males and females and try to pair them up to create these little compatible beaver couples. It's sort of like a beaver Tinder service, where you're forming ideally successful beaver pairs. And like Tinder, not all of the dates go that well, but when it works, you can move this happy beaver couple up into there's a national forest, and hopefully they'll settle down and stay put and start building a dam where you stuck them. I think that one of the misconceptions maybe about beavers is that they're these hyper busy workaholics, right? Busy beavers is the phrase you always hear. Like they're sort of like these joyless automatons who are just driven to labor at all times. But I don't think that's really true. I think that beavers, more than being busy for the sake of being busy, they're very efficient animals. So beavers don't always build dams. They actually, I think in general, they probably prefer not to build dams. They're very happy living in a large body of water, like Lake Washington, or a large river where they can get away with not building a dam at all. So more than being busy, they're efficient. They do what they have to do in whatever context they're in to maximize their own habitat. And I find that very identifiable and relatable. Like humans, they're kind of relentlessly driven to to modify their own surroundings to maximize their own food and shelter. And there really aren't many other animals that do that. So I think that beavers are they're hyper efficient. They're really good at engineering their environment. And the problem, of course, is that when they butt heads with another animal that loves to engineer its environment, us, problems can arise. I think that our vision for what the landscape should look like and their vision is very different, right? We like these tidy, orderly rivers and streams that stay within their banks, and standing live trees that that don't fall onto people's cars. Whereas beavers create these ecosystems that to us look like chaos, right? They're forcing water out onto the floodplain. They're taking these single thread streams and making them these complex multi-threaded channels. They're engineering these environments that are very messy and that don't necessarily look like our conception of the perfect stream that you would want to go fly fish in. But those complex, messy, dynamic ecosystems that beavers engineer are hugely important for the ecosystem and all kinds of reasons. The answer is yes. There is a way, and it's through the use of what's called a beaver dam analog, which is basically a human-built or human-started beaver dam. So basically, you just pound a few vertical logs into the stream bed and maybe weave a little bit of willow branches through those logs, and you're basically trying to create, a bit of a starter kit, a dam that beavers can show up and improve upon. Because again, they're efficient animals, right? If they'd much rather work on an existing dam than have to start one from scratch. So you can use these dams to basically guide their activities, and that's worked really well. The classic case study is in Oregon at a place called Bridge Creek, which is part of the John Day watershed, and there scientists built a whole bunch of these beaver dam analogs, and basically in an ecosystem that already had beavers, but the beavers were having a hard time establishing and building stable dams. Beaver activity in this area dramatically increased and created really fantastic habitat for juvenile steelhead in this case. So that's a great example of using these beaver dam analogs to basically encourage beaver activity in a place where you want them to create habitat for a threatened fish. It's a pretty cool case study. First, you have to think about what it's like to be a juvenile salmon, right? If you're, a little finger-length baby coho or sockeye or chinook, right? You don't want to live in the big main stem of a river because the force of the current is just going to blow you downstream. You want to live in some kind of slow water, complex habitat. A side channel or a pool or an eddy or a backwater, somewhere where you can get out of the current, conserve your energy, find some, brushy, woody debris to take cover under to escape from, great blue herons and kingfishers, and basically be safe and grow. And beavers create exactly those kinds of habitats, right? They push water all over the place. They create these deep pools. They create amazing habitat for juvenile salmon, and there are lots of studies showing this. So that's kind of the beaver-salmon connection. Is that we know these animals are really good at growing baby salmon, which becomes incredibly important in this era of mega dams and climate change and pollution in Puget Sound. Anything we can do to increase juvenile salmon production, just increases the number of fish, ideally, that eventually return to spawn. I would rank Washington as the most beaver-friendly state in the country, and as a resident, I'm somewhat biased, but I do think that most beaver experts would agree on that designation. Certainly there are lots and lots of projects all over the state that are doing beaver relocation and restoration. Washington has very sort of friendly beaver laws. Essentially, there's a beaver bill that was passed several years ago and then was just updated recently to permit the relocation of beavers, which isn't true in every state. California, for example, it's basically impossible to live trap and relocate a beaver. So Washington has great beaver laws. There are all kinds of groups. In Seattle, there's Beavers Northwest, is a fantastic group that does beaver coexistence and education work. That's a really wonderful organization. The Tulalip tribe does lots of beaver relocations around King County. They've done a fantastic job. Back east, where I live in Spokane, there's the Lands Council, is another great beaver relocation group. There's, I mean, there are too many to name. The Yakima tribe, Trout Unlimited in the Wenatchee area just started a project. So there, at this point, there are probably something like 8 different groups that are doing beaver relocation and restoration all over Washington State. And certainly there's no other state in the country that has that density of beaver restoration professionals. So I'm very proud to live in what I think is the most pro-beaver state in America. I think we're doing okay. We could certainly be a lot better in many ways. I think that what I would love to see more of is non-lethal beaver coexistence. Right? That's the big problem that we have all over the country is this very reflexive, lethal approach to beaver conflicts. Right? A beaver builds a dam in a road culvert or cuts down some valuable timber somewhere, and the response 95 times out of 100, I would say, is to kill those beavers. And that's problematic for a couple of reasons. I mean, first, of course, when you kill the beavers, you're eliminating all of that great pond and wetland habitat that we know is so important. But also, you're just creating a vacancy sign, essentially, for the next family of beavers, right? As long as the beaver habitat is there, beavers are going to find their way back. So lots of communities end up on this very expensive cycle of trapping and recolonization and trapping and recolonization that doesn't make a whole lot of cost-benefit sense, and is also bad for the beavers and the ecosystem. So fortunately, there are lots of ways of solving beaver conflicts non-lethally. There's this technology called a flow device, which is basically a pipe and fence system that regulates the height of beaver ponds so that they don't, you can basically use one of these contraptions to to prevent the pond from flooding your backyard while letting the beavers stay where they are. You're kind of striking a balance in the height of the pond where it's acceptable for both the humans and the rodents. And Beavers Northwest does a lot of this work around the Seattle area. So I'd love to see more use of these flow device systems, basically to solve beaver conflicts non-lethally, to prevent the problem while letting the beavers remain alive and in place. They're pretty resilient animals. I mean, to me, it's just so impressive to see them living in very urban areas, right? I mean, there are beavers all over Seattle. I mean, to me, that's impressive that that a large animal can make do in an urban setting. In the wild, certainly there are lots of animals that do prey on beavers: cougars, black bears, coyotes, wolves. Wolves especially love beavers. Very, very important part of wolf diets. So they do get eaten. But then again, their great talent, of course, is engineering their own environment to maximize their shelter. Right? I mean, that's why beavers build dams, to create these deep pools of water where they can take refuge from predators like wolves. And again, that's a very unique behavior, right? To engineer your environment to maximize your own safety is pretty impressive. So yeah, they're pretty resilient animals, and to me, I mean, the ultimate testament to their resilience is just the incredible comeback they made during the 20th century, right? I mean, here's an animal that was abundant beyond measure in North America when European colonists first arrived. There were, we don't really know, but the best estimate is that there were several 100 million beavers in North America at the time of European colonization. And by 1900, we trapped so many beavers that they were basically extinct in the lower 48. There were about 100,000 beavers left in all of North America. We went from 400 million potentially to 100,000. And now they've bounced back in a huge way. Now there are probably 10 to 15 million beavers in North America. So that's really an incredible accomplishment, an incredible comeback, and a great testament to how good these animals are at reproducing and spreading and engineering the conditions for their own survival. So they're a pretty resilient animal and an amazing wildlife success story. They're very good at sort of taking advantage of whatever environment you give them. And, in Seattle, there's a great paper that came out recently by David Bailey and I believe Ben Goldfarb, that found that I think 86% of the available beaver habitat in the city of Seattle is occupied. That's incredible. You've got this, one of the largest cities in the country, and beavers are basically making a go of it, pretty much anywhere that they could possibly exist. And what was cool about that particular scientific paper was that there were some great recommendations in there about how to design beaver-friendly parks and green spaces, ecosystems in urban areas that can be used by people that can also support beavers. For like things like, so beavers love building in road culverts, right? That's one of their favorite things to do. If you're a beaver, the road bed is basically the dam, and the culvert, the pipe, is the leak in the dam, right? So beavers plug the leak, and the road washes out. Instead of using culverts in some situations, maybe installing a bridge so that beavers can't plug that hole is a good approach. So this paper had lots of great recommendations for creating urban environments that both support beavers but also prevent beavers from causing conflicts. And I think that's sort of where our urban design has to go. Is inviting beavers into some of our spaces to create wonderful fish and wildlife habitat and improve our water quality and reverse erosion and do all of this wonderful stuff while still preventing conflicts from occurring. Beaver behavior is pretty mysterious. Oftentimes it seems like we actually know more about the environments they engineer than we do about the basic biology and ecology of the animals themselves. I think there are lots of questions we still have, and one of them is certainly, why do beavers leave their ponds when they do? There are lots of places that I've gone where you see what looks like really good habitat, plenty of available food, and the beavers haven't been in there for a year, and it's not totally clear why that is. There are lots of possible reasons. I mean, that they could have been eaten by a predator, without us realizing it. They do deplete their food supply sometimes and have to move on. Oftentimes, those beaver ponds will fill in with sediment, right? As the water slows down, the sediment that's being carried along settles out, and the bottom of the pond essentially rises, and the pond turns into a wetland, and then eventually a wet meadow, and the beavers, will migrate up or downstream to the next site. So yeah, but I think a really important thing to remember is that that cycle of beavers damming and leaving and damming and leaving, that's a really important part of the process, right? I mean, beavers, beaver environments are inherently dynamic. They're always changing, and the different phases in that process are all very important, right? I mean, when that pond turns into a wetland and then a wet meadow, it becomes a great place for moose and deer and other browsers and black bears. So every phase in the beaver colonization and damming and environmental modification cycle is sort of unique and important. So there are kind of two basic types of beaver structures, right? There's the lodge, which is sort of the beaver house. It's, often you see it as kind of like a little island popping up in the middle of the pond. Inside the lodge, you've got kind of an elevated nesting platform, and there are a few underwater tunnels that lead up into the lodge. So that's the lodge, that's the basic beaver house. And then the dam, are these walls they build essentially to hold back water and create these ponds and wetlands where they feel safe. And those dams come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. I was in Eastern Washington, where I live. Most of the dams I've seen here are fairly small, right? I mean, maybe 30 feet long would be a pretty big dam here, and a few feet high. And that's because we've got, it's pretty dry out here. We have kind of steep, flashy streams. It's not a great place to, build a really impressive beaver dam. But earlier this summer, I went to Minnesota, where the land is much flatter, and it's very wet. It's just a good place to be a beaver. And some of the dams I saw there, were 600 feet long and 13 or 14 feet tall, and you could walk along the top of them and feel like you were on top of the world. So, and those dams had been worked on by many generations of beavers over the course of many decades. So, yeah, the kinds of structures they build just depend on the environment they're in. I remember going to, in the course of reporting the book, I went to a granite quarry in Massachusetts where beavers had set up shop, and they actually built their lodge there using pieces of granite from the quarry that they had hauled over and incorporated in the lodge. So they're just really flexible, adaptable animals that are good at working with whatever you give them. Yeah, they can, they can do some pretty sizable felling. I wish I think that can't recall the precise record diameter of a large beaver, the largest beaver felled tree known. But yeah, they can take down some pretty sizable specimens. I mean, I think that like the trees they favor, would be something that you could probably get both your hands around. Those make the best building materials to work with. But yeah, there's no question they can fell some pretty impressive stuff. I think 30-something inches, now that I'm thinking about it, is the record diameter. So that's a pretty sizable piece of material. Beavers are using trees for two reasons, right? I mean, first, they're actually eating the cambium, or the inner bark of the tree. That's kind of the sugary layer of the tree that does the growing. It's the good nutritious stuff. And they're also, of course, using the wood as construction materials. They're basically peeling these sticks and logs as food, and then they're incorporating the wood in the dams and lodges. And as for your point about them being sort of rotational farmers, yeah, I mean so one of the cool things to think about is the fact that beavers have been operating on North American landscapes for millions of years, right? And in that time, the vegetation that they eat has evolved all kinds of responses to beaver cutting, right? So lots of the trees we have, like willow is the perfect example. Coppice, when you cut it, right? You cut down a willow and it resprouts. And that is, in some ways, likely a response to beaver cutting, right? To beaver harvesting. So what you do often see in these beaver complexes is beavers, felling willow on one side of the pond, going over the other side of the pond, and basically letting that vegetation regrow. Exactly. They're doing this kind of rotational grazing thing, essentially. And they're also, by raising the water table at these pond complexes, they're actually irrigating their own food supply. So they're willows and cottonwoods and aspen, these are beavers' preferred trees, and they like having shallow water tables where they can really access moisture, and beavers create these wet environments that are very favorable for the growth of the trees they eat. That's a fascinating story. Yeah. So beavers were introduced to Argentina and Chile in the 1940s, I think 1946, and the point was basically to start a fur trade. It was an economic opportunity, and they were introduced to Tierra del Fuego at the very southern tip of South America, that archipelago down there. And yeah, as you say, they just kind of went wild. Our trees, right? They have all of these evolved adaptations to deal with beavers. They resprout. Cottonwoods actually produce these tannins that are distasteful to beavers. So once they get chewed on, they produce these chemicals that sort of deter further chewing. But of course, the trees in South America don't have those adaptations. They don't have those defensive chemicals. They don't do well in wet soil, unlike alder, for example. So when beavers were introduced to South America, they just clear cut all of these forests. And I haven't been down there, unfortunately, but you see pictures, and it's just these incredible clear cut landscapes with just dead white trees everywhere. And they're considered kind of an environmental disaster, unfortunately. And Chile and Argentina last year announced this joint plan to kill 100,000 beavers, which a lot of the beaver advocates in North America argued for live trapping and repatriating some of those beavers, which I don't think makes a whole lot of sense. But it's certainly a sad situation and kind of a difficult ethical problem. Yeah, I saw those pictures from last week. It's unfortunately moving 100,000 beavers from South America to North America is probably a little more challenging than than helicoptering a few goats. But I guess what's fascinating to me about that situation is the way in which beavers have become part of the landscape down there. You know, that it's true that they are clear-cutting these vital old-growth forests, you know, but they're also creating good habitat for some native species. You know, there's a native endangered fish in Argentina that has done pretty well because it, you know, like salmon, it appreciates these slow water refuges that beavers create. There's a woodpecker that nests in the dead trees, the snags that are killed by rising water tables. You know, so yes, I think on balance, you know, certainly they're very much a negative thing in South America, but you know, there are winners as well as losers in any species invasion. Well, besides the obvious that beavers are awesome, you know, I think to me the lesson of the book is it's about working with nature rather than against it, right? I mean, for hundreds of years, you know, thousands of years, back on, you know, on the European continent, you know, we've been, or at least, you know, some cultures, of which I am certainly a part, have been dominating and destroying nature, right? We subjugate nature. You know, we control populations of wild predators, and we, you know, clear-cut forests, and we plant these corn and soy monocultures. You know, we exert our will on the natural world. And to me, you know, the lesson of beavers is it's about recognizing that there's this species that, you know, in some ways does what we do. You know, not to the same magnitude as us, of course, but, you know, just like us, beavers are modifying their ecosystems to maximize their own food and shelter, which is pretty impressive. And by basically getting out of the way and letting beavers control and manage some of these ecosystems for us around the Northwest, you know, we can really make a lot of environmental progress. I mean, I think that the mantra of many beaver believers, and this is a credit to a guy named Joe Wheaton, a beaver scientist in Utah, is let the rodent do the work, right? Stay out of the way and allow these animals to create salmon habitat, filter our water, store our water in the face of drought, create wildfire breaks and refugia. You know, let these animals manage ecosystems and you know, do it a whole lot cheaper than we're doing it. You know, and do it without permits. That's always nice. And you know, do it in a way that encourages other forms of life rather than depletes them as we humans tend to do. So let the rodent do the work, to me, is the takeaway.